I'm absolutely delighted to have Donnie Munro on the line. Hi, Donnie.
Hi.
Donnie Munro on the line. Hi, Donnie.
Hi, Karin. How are you? Delighted to join you and all your listeners. Can I wish you a very happy new year?
And to you as well. Have you had a good time?
Well, I mean, it was lovely. It was family, and I think, like everybody else, it's a very strange time. It's a very strange threshold, I think, for us all, going out of 2020 into 2021. Certainly going into another year with a lot of hopefulness that we experience a much better year than the one we've just been through.
Oh, I hope so, because your family's spread far and wide now. It must be awful for you not to be able to be travelling.
Well, it is. It's difficult. We have our daughter in Melbourne, Australia, where of course they've been in pretty severe lockdown, despite their very low numbers. They've been severely locked down for quite a long time. But we have 2 grandchildren there, and obviously, they would have been home this summer had things been normal.
Yes.
So for many people, it's been a difficult time, I think, and particularly people who felt, very isolated and cut off by this. So let's just hope for better times in 2021, and let's hope that the vaccine, gives us the answer to controlling all of this. Absolutely. And I'm sure it will.
Yeah. Well, have you been doing much music when you've been in lockdown? Have you had the chance?
Not obviously, clearly not performing, and I've not, unlike many incredibly creative musicians, I have watched in admiration at some of the exceptional online performances. I mean, I just find it absolutely staggering and mind-boggling to see people performing together live, from different locations and using technology so creatively. It's really opened my eyes and I think opened up so many other possibilities for musicians who this year, have just had to really struggle through such an awful time. I think it's just been appalling for people whose livelihoods depend on the opportunity of performing live, touring, etc. Mm-hmm. So it's been a big learning curve for many people. I have to say, personally, I've not jumped onto that learning curve, but I have enjoyed it, and as I've said, I've been utterly amazed and knocked out at some of the incredible performances and the quality of performance that musicians have put on using technology. But apart from that, I've had my moments just of, picking up the guitar and working on things, and, there's always some kind of idea milling around.
Have you been writing much?
Not a great deal, but like I say, often the starting point is just small things. I've actually been spending more time on my other kind of creative pursuit. My first professional area and passion of painting. So I've been getting back into painting, and I've produced a couple of fairly major pieces of work. So that's another area to be explored in this coming year.
How do you do your painting? Do you go out and paint something that you see, or do you have something in your mind that you put onto canvas?
Well, a lot of things. I mean, most of the work that I've done, and this is kind of throughout the years, from art school days onwards, and even when I was touring with Runrig, I used to take art material with me, and I remember in one particular tour in Europe, in Denmark, and then into Germany. I ended up producing 18 pieces of work during that tour, which I exhibited at the Scottish Gallery in Dundas Street in Edinburgh. And a lot of these were kind of combinations of landscape images, where I was traveling, but also interiors. I've always had a real interest in interior, in that kind of threshold between the interior world of things that we're comfortable and familiar with, still life objects, things that tell a little bit about the human story, and then the external world that So I use a lot of kind of window landscape interior compositions. So they're mainly constructs, but I use a lot of the landscape that I see out front, and the most recent one I've done is actually now in my son's coffee house, in the Birch Coffee House in Portree. So, and it's called Still Life on the Bay. So, as the title might suggest, it's looking out onto Portree Bay.
Such a beautiful place. I really miss getting up there because we spent so many Christmases and New Years up in Skye.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you've spent a lot of time on the island and enjoyed being here. Has
it changed much?
No, I mean, it's really quite funny. This year, despite COVID, when COVID, after lockdown and the restrictions were lessened and things became slightly more relaxed, Skye experienced a really, a pretty busy period of almost like a normal summer, to be honest, with numbers, but a different kind of profile. Mainly or virtually exclusively, UK-based tourists who were coming, and the camper van became the big thing because it gave people independence and freedom, and it still gave them the opportunity to remain kind of in a bubble, if you like, almost literally.
Yes.
And so we noticed a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, I think it really was quite busy towards the end of the summer and into autumn. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, no, not a great deal of change. But like everybody else at the beginning of lockdown, much quieter, and in many ways, we felt kind of cushioned from what was going on because of the kind of freedoms that you have in a rural environment. We were able to get out into the countryside and to walk,
yes,
close to home and to be able to access that. So we were extremely fortunate, and in comparison to people, in an urban area, for example, or living in an apartment or, flat in a high-rise, or, these people really experienced a tough time. We had a very easy time in comparison, and we had a period of fantastic weather, from that period of March into April and May. So we were very lucky, and the sense of COVID being a real issue with us only really arrived when we had the tragic events of the home farm care home.
Yes.
The outbreak there, which was, really tragic. But again, very contained, and, COVID simply wasn't at all in evidence in the community in Skye.
Is it still
so
the same
I think
now?
we were very cushioned from the reality of it in many ways.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you to cast your mind back to your early days with Runrig.
Yeah.
When I was speaking on Friday with, I think it was when I was speaking with Rory, and just say, were you aware how much the band was doing to promote Gaelic language and culture? Was that a conscious thing?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting thing, and I'm sure Callum and Rory would probably agree that, we were stimulated, by a desire, in the first instance, to perform new songs that were being written by Callum and Rory, and particularly when Gaelic songs appeared, that was a very definite decision on our part, and Play Gaelic, the album, reflected that desire. Up until that point, we had been performing lots of material by other artists and had become quite a popular band, if you like, playing cover versions and chart songs, etc., around the Highlands, the dance halls and village halls in the Highlands. But yeah, with Play Gaelic and with these songs, something new was happening and was important to us. But I think it would be wrong to say that we had any sense of ourselves as being, some sort of ambassadors or some kind of flagship for a Gaelic revival. I think what we were doing was actually simply a very natural thing was expressing ideas through what was in many ways our own first language in early childhood. But I certainly became aware, I mean, subsequently, you know, with the opportunity of standing back a little from it, and in my own case, meeting many people who were involved with Gaelic language revival in a very direct way and in a sort of political way and through education. I'm very, very, very aware now of the position that the band has occupied in the consciousness of the Gaels, and in particular in the reawakening of a sense of pride and purpose with the language. And I think that is something that we can all reflect on, you know, very positively, but again in a very natural way, because it wasn't something that any of us sat down and said, let's set about doing something to revive the Gaelic language. It was a much more natural situation than that. It was just, let's do something about and through the medium of something which is entirely natural to us and to the cultural inheritance of our, you know, through our families and through the history of our people. And a lot of that obviously reflected on areas of political concern, you know, whether it was the power and abuse of power, of landlordism, of the manipulation of people, you know, reflecting on the dark, difficult period of the clearances, and also the very difficult period in relation to language and how the Gaelic language was very much discouraged. And we were, to a large extent, inheritors of, you know, quite a difficult and maybe oppressed history. And I think all of us, you know, certainly Calman, Uri and I, would all have felt that in our early childhood and would not have been naturally attracted to the language other than in a natural way through our families. But, you know, at that point, it wasn't presented as either educationally useful or culturally significant. And so in many ways, in our minds, it was quite an uncool thing.
When would you say that changed?
I'm sorry?
When would you say that changed? When did the position change?
I think it changed for us in many ways when we left, you know, the island community and the Gaelic community and went to study in, like many other young people from the Highlands and Islands, in the larger cities. And just that kind of separation and finding yourself, you know, in a bigger urban environment, you know, with people, you know, from a very wide background and a very wide cultural mix. It kind of made you more aware of, well, what are the things that actually formed, you know, yourself as an individual. And of course, you know, the things that made us kind of have a particular world view, you know, were things like the language and the culture and the songs and the values of the people. And that's inheritance. And I think that fed into a sense of a kind of reappraisal, if you like, of the worth of our culture, which up until our parents' generation had been pretty negatively portrayed.
Yes. I wonder how many people actually started learning Gaelic because of becoming fans of the band. I think there's quite a few.
Yeah, I mean, I've met a lot of people who have been through that process, and, you know, with my involvement with Salmór Ostig on Skye, the National Centre for Gaelic Language and Culture, many students who have come to do their degree programmes at Salmór Ostig have certainly come through having been people who were interested in Runrig's songs and music, and who chose to take it a stage further and became engaged with the language and the culture through that entry point, which was, you know, Runrig's music. And it reflected internationally because, you know, Salmór Ostig has enjoyed a very wide-ranging international community of students, and many from Sweden, Denmark, Norway, the Scandinavian countries, and in particular many German students.
Yes.
Who have gone on to have been extremely expert learners of the language.
Yes, certainly. I know quite a few German Runrig fans who, well, they can pronounce the Gaelic an awful lot better than I can.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've met a lot of these learners who, would put us all to shame, and that's even, native speakers. They go into it with such depth and learning it now, working in an academic way through the grammar, an understanding of the structures of the language in a way that we as native speakers wouldn't have, if you like. It's a natural thing that you inherit if your parents, have the language. It's kind of learned very naturally from your parents, from your mother or your grandparents. But a lot of these new learners learn, a very high standard grammatically and a very deep understanding of the origins and the structures of language.
Do you ever write songs yourself in Gaelic?
Sorry?
Do you write songs in Gaelic yourself?
I have done. They've been fairly few and far between, I have to say. But I've had Gaelic songs on some of my own solo albums. It takes time, I think, writing songs in any case is something I think is a real craft that you have to work very hard at to do well. Songs don't really arrive, ready wrapped on their own. You've got to set yourself to work. I think it is, I think a lot of, most creative areas, whether it's, visual art or literature or songwriting or poetry, much of it is based around an application, a kind of working situation. It's about process, and the process is what leads you there. So you have to work very hard at it. And it, as it happens, I took time to develop some of my own songs in English, and just to try and develop the craft. And I think we can look at, I think anybody who writes will look at maybe out of 10 things that you've thought about or you've written, maybe 9 of them are things that you feel, are okay, and maybe there's one you feel strongly about that you're very pleased or glad that you've written. So I think it's a difficult process in working through it. And with the language, I certainly enjoyed working with the language, but I probably it's more whether the original thought was in Gaelic language or whether there was a hybrid of thinking of an idea in both languages, in English and in Gaelic, and that Gaelic was the language that suited the subject matter best, and worked kind of poetically, if you like, the best.
Did you enjoy the freedom that doing your own solo albums gave you to pick and choose? Because you've written some absolutely beautiful songs. I'm thinking Glasgow Joe, Irene. I mean, there's loads of them. And then, of course,
thanks.
on
very kind.
Heart of America, that was an award-winning album, and that had a fair few of your songs on it. So, do you enjoy that process? You think it's?
I mean, it's a creative process. So it's like a journey. I see it as very similar. In many ways to painting. You start, you make a mark, you have to get a starting point. And the journey of developing an idea is exciting and interesting. And then, of course, when you introduce that idea to other players, who bring their own qualities and their own personality, if you like, of playing to the track, it's great fun, and it's a great privilege, to work with people in that way in the studio creatively. I mean, it has its difficulties because sometimes, you can go off on a tangent with something that maybe you hadn't intended. And you make good and bad decisions, and I've made some bad ones, and thankfully, I'd like to think that there are a few songs that I've done that I can say, I'm happy with it. I think they're, decent pieces of work. And others, you find, you revisit material. And there was one song on one of the early albums that I remember, not being very committed to, and having never having performed it live, just because I'd kind of come in my own mind to think it wasn't the strongest song, and then hearing it and revisiting it, a number of years later on a journey in a vehicle when it came on the radio, and I hadn't heard it for a long time, and I'd already, at the time I'd made the decision that it wasn't a very great song, but actually when I heard it, maybe 6 years later, I thought, I quite like that. There's something I like about it, So it can surprise you, I guess,
You've been able to be playing with some wonderful musicians that I'm very honoured to have been able to spend time with on the road. But I'm thinking, your big band, if you like.
Yeah, the full band was great players, fantastic players.
Great fun as well.
Without going into individuals, they were all really, top players, with their instrument, and I was extremely fortunate to have had the opportunity of putting a pool of players like that together, and with the producer, with Chris Harley, a late dear friend and mentor and producer over many years. Chris was the catalyst, for a lot of these people, and I had worked with him in various sessions, on other projects that he had worked on over the years, and when I came to do the first album, he was able to pull these people in, and because of working well together, they became the nucleus of the band. And I was extremely lucky, and I mean some of the players were just so professional. There were times when I had arrived at a sound check with a new song, and just had a feeling that I'd like to try it, and I would play it at a sound check, and know that by the time we ran it a couple of times, that they would play it, without a flaw on the night, and that kind of thing is a skill that I don't have, but they did. In fact, they often used to kind of keep me right, even though I'd written the songs. I used to get frowned at quite a lot because they knew the arrangements better than I did.
And then your most recent shows were with Eric and Maggie, of course, on the fiddle.
Yeah, I was very lucky. In fact, and because we're on air together, I have you to thank for the being able to have been able to work with Maggie Adamson, who, as you and I both know, is an absolutely outstanding, young musician. And I was delighted that she was able to come in and work again with Eric Cloughley, who I met in the first instance as an engineer, a producer who worked with Chris Harley in the studio. And during that experience, Eric would often, in reviewing tracks or looking at tracks and how things are working out, would often pick up, an acoustic guitar and play along or suggest ideas, and I just became aware that he was just a really great musician that nobody really heard, and so I was offered an acoustic slot. The very first one I did, I was offered a slot at a big festival in Denmark, up in the north of Denmark, and because I'd been in the studio with Eric, I asked him if he would like to perform the show with me, and so we worked on the material together, and we just both enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed that stripped back approach, of it being an extremely intimate performance, rather than the full sound of I mean, there's great excitement in the full sound of the band, but there's also something very appealing about that, just the kind of intimacy that an acoustic performance allows you to enjoy. And so, I worked with Eric for a while, and then, of course, we were lucky, through yourself, to introduce Maggie, who was just a very young player at the time, at the conservatoire.
Yeah, I'd known Maggie since she was about 11, and she was winning, because I was in the box and fiddle scene at that time, and all the festivals, all the accordion and fiddle festivals, she won all the fiddle competitions all the time. And when you had said that you'd love to have a young fiddle player who wasn't necessarily well known but was very competent, I thought of her right away.
Well, she brought an amazing quality to what we were doing, and she's an extremely modest player and a modest individual and a lovely person to work with. And I think the thing that worked well for Maggie as well as a player was that she wasn't quite so used to working with songs at that point in her career. She was studying classical violin at the RCS, and that prior to that, most of her work was based around, traditional music, dance band music, but instrumental music. And so working with songs was a kind of different challenge for her, and I think she really enjoyed that opportunity to work, very subtly. And she has got this fantastic feel, and will put in beautiful lines, and lovely phrasing, and lovely musical touches in a very subtle way.
Yes.
And it really adds, so much to the way, she works beautifully and sensitively around a vocal melodies, and for me, she was and is a delight to work with, and the other thing is just her nature and her personality. When you're on stage and you look at Maggie, she just exudes pleasure and enthusiasm about music. She just loves her music. She loves being there. She loves playing, and that carries across so much in what she does. And it didn't take very long for our audience, for my audience on the tours, and especially out in Germany, to become so enamored of this young Shetland girl and her incredible musical heart.
Oh, she's amazing. So not just in music, but learning to fly. She's a very, very competent sailor.
She's an amazing girl. She really is. She's got so many strings to her bow other than the violin and fiddle. But as you say, she's a very experienced sailor now, and has got. She's gone through lots of her training with the sailing ships and working with young people, and her captain's ticket and various things like that. Yeah, she's just a great character as well. But great fun, and lots of fun to be with.
She is. I think I'll go and see if I can find a track of Maggie playing, and we'll play that as well. One of the early ones. And of your acoustic ones, is there anything on there that you would recommend that shows, sort of highlights her playing?
Oh gosh, it's so difficult because of all the acoustic set, her playing on so many of the tracks, it's just so lovely. I had a wonderful experience actually in Germany where I was playing, and I had a letter delivered to a venue. We were playing in what had been a church venue, a converted church, a very old converted church. I can't remember the town we were in, but somebody had simply written me a letter saying, given the fact that you're performing in a church, would you consider performing the song "The Highest Apple" in the Ulazarship in this location, and so at the sound check, I mean, literally, honestly, at the sound check, I said to both Eric and Maggie, I'd like to do this song tonight to open the show with it. And they'd never played it. I mean, they'd heard the song, they were aware of the the Run Rig performance and of the song, but we ran it a couple of times at a sound check. And I'm quite sad, actually, that although we were recording that tour, I'm kind of sad we didn't record that particular track. For some reason, I can't remember. It would have been that technical thing. But we came out and we started the show with it. Normally, we would try and open a show with something that was pretty up-tempo and, set a bit of a pace at the beginning of a show. But I came on and I explained that I wanted to perform this song specifically because somebody had written in advance, and that as we were here, it felt appropriate, and we did a version of Ulas Arsha and Highest Apple that just worked. One of these kind of periods of fortuitous kind of magic that can happen, and it certainly happened there. But a lot of it was based around Maggie and Eric's fantastic musicality and their sensitivity to the vocal.
You've always been a very generous performer when it comes to the musicians around you. You would give them their time in the spotlight as well. Is that conscious, or?
I just think that's one of the important things about it. I mean, when you're with somebody like Maggie and indeed with Eric, one of the wonderful things of working with Eric as an acoustic player is that he's a very experienced bass player. It was what he started out as in the first instance when he was playing in Edinburgh in the late 70s and into the 80s. He was playing with a lot of Edinburgh bands at that time, and he was a bass player, and he carries that instinctive feeling of playing at the bottom end as a bass player into his acoustic guitar playing, and so he's got a great ability to create a very rich sound. Sometimes, an acoustic sound maybe you feel is a bit light on the kind of bottom end, on the kind of bass harmonies, if you like, and the bass notes. But with Eric's playing, it's a very rich. He's a very, very adept, and competent player. He plays acoustic guitar extremely well, but like I said, with an emphasis on the bottom end. And so he again, added a really rich dimension to the acoustic sound. And when you have that kind of two people like that playing, or with the big band sound, when you have people like Morph Dobie or Chaz Stewart playing lead guitar, and Foss Parrish, and some of the piano playing that I become aware of when I recorded live and listened back to, I heard things that you're not aware of in the midst of a live performance, but listening back, you listen to just the musicality of some of the playing, and so when you're surrounded by that, it's right to give it its place,
I'm going to play a couple of tracks, the Run Rig one that you've chosen, but I'd also like to play Glasgow Joe, because I know that's one that is so close to your heart.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, songs are amazing things in being able, I think, to allow people to express, things that are deeply emotional, and it can take time to work through it. I mean, I've experienced this with other songs. There's a song called Irene as well, on one of the earlier albums that I wrote about a very tragic event in our lives where we lost three very dear friends in a car accident on the Oban Road in New Year, Hogmanay Millennium Year 2000. And it was a really, really awful, deeply painful experience for all of the people who knew them. And our very special friend was the only survivor in the car of the 4 people. Our friend Irene survived. So the song was formed around her name and a kind of imagined conversation between our friend who died, Mary Rorty, and her lifelong friend Irene. And I had written this song, and when something's very raw like that, it takes time, for you to be able to maybe think about performing it. And I had written it, I'd performed it 100 times, in the writing, and gone over it and recorded it and managed my way through it, singing it, and all the emotional content. But when I came to commit it to record, I decided I needed to phone the person involved and the families to say, look, I've written this song and I'd like to put it on the album. It's dedicated to Mary Rorty, but it has the name Irene in the chorus. And I phoned my friend Irene and asked, how she felt and how she thought Mary's family would feel. And she was very, very positive and said, oh, her family would love it. It's a wonderful thing to have. And so I said, well, can I read it to you? Because, I want you to hear, what the lyrics are. And I started reading it, not singing it. I started just reading it. And I couldn't read it. I actually broke down reading it. But I'd sung it 100 times.
Yeah.
And there's something about melody. There's something about melody that can carry emotion. Very deep emotion, raw and deep emotion. It somehow or other wraps itself around you in a way that kind of protects you from it, or allows you to manage your emotion, to deal with that emotion. And I think Glasgow Joe became a song like that. It was dedicated to my brother-in-law, my wife Teresa's brother Joe, and he died very tragically with us here, far too young. And I wrote the song and his dedicated to him and to his memory. And again, that it's that thing that sometimes just being involved in writing something and having a melody that is wrapped around that emotional content just allows you to do it.
Yeah.
And these things are important for me, certainly, and for any person writing, I'm quite sure, as an individual, because it takes you through difficult things and allows you to express things in a particular way. That I've always admired poets who do this with words, and I've always felt that poets were like the kind of emotional acrobats who performing without the safety net of a melody.
Well, we're going. Actually, I'm going to play both of those songs, but just to touch very briefly, because you've had career before, after your time with the band with Runrig, but do you miss performing with Runrig?
I mean, I've said this to so many people. Runrig. I mean, I have to say that when people spoke about it, I departed. I departed from Runrig, but never left. And that might sound strange, but I could never leave Runrig. Runrig is something that is at the very centre, at the very core of me as a person, in my history, in my emotions, in my shared history, particularly going back, with Callum and Rory and Malcolm to the earliest points, And I could never see or talk about Runrig as something that was separate from me, even when I wasn't performing it with Runrig. When after I had stopped working with the band, and Bruce had come in and replaced me in that situation, I didn't feel separate from the band at any time in my life, nor will I ever.
And you were there for the last dance with your band.
Yeah, I mean, it was something we discussed, and Rory and Callum Malcolm and I discussed how we might best express that kind of history and shared history. And Rory had been to a concert of mine in the Queen's Hall in Edinburgh, and again, it was one of these nights, and you were there yourself. On that night, Karen.
I remember Rory and Debbie talking about it.
It was one of the early performances with Maggie Adamson, and in fact Maggie had some travel difficulties and arrived for the second half of the show.
That's right.
But there was something that night about the Queen's Hall crowd, about the atmosphere, about the acoustic, about the performance, about the material. Just one of these nights that many performers will find in their memory of different gigs, where things just converge to create a kind of perfection, and that happened that night. And I was so glad that Rory was there, and we spoke afterwards. And of course, for Rory, it was the first time he'd listened to some of the early songs that we had shared, that he and I had shared, hearing them in an acoustic form. And I was so pleased that he was there, and that he was so positive in his response. He loved the concert. He thought the show went really well, and he loved hearing the acoustic versions, the new settings for his own songs that he and Callum had written together. And it was really on the basis of that they felt that that the last show would have been it was just a nice way of having that connection, in a natural way of having me perform with the acoustic set at the beginning, and to develop and explore some of the songs that by that time the band had ceased to perform, and had not obviously included in the set for that event. And then later to come on midway through the main Runrig set with the Glasgow Island Choir, and to do the two choral numbers with them. It was fantastic, and I was delighted to be able to do that. As indeed I was at the party on the moor, with the anniversary gig, before that, where for the first time I had the opportunity of being able to sing and perform, with Bruce, and that was a lovely.
Well, you did the cut, because I knew, of course, that you were coming on that, but the rest of the audience didn't know.
Yeah,
it was a well-kept secret.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was just a nice thing to do. Because, I mean, I really deeply appreciated, Bruce, as an artist. I mean, in his own right, I appreciated him as an artist, with his own material, and I think he's a fantastically talented musician and singer and writer. And I loved his performances with Runrig over the years, and there were certain songs that I enjoyed him performing, and looking back on it, songs like The Old Boys, and his version of that vocal, and Paul Mouncey's production on it, I thought it was just quite exceptional. So that was a nice thing, just for us to be able to connect. Yeah.
It was fantastic. But Donnie, as usual, we've blethered and blethered, and I know exactly what I'm going to play, but I did mention, I asked you for a favourite song from Runrig, the Runrig era.
Yeah.
And you said Flower of the West, and I always remember that as the last song before the first encore.
Yeah, I mean, on that tour, it certainly was, and I mean, for me, it's just Flower of the West is such a kind of uplifting. I think it's just a glorious song, and it's one of these songs. It's kind of really a hallmarked, Runrig song. The big landscape, the journey, the physical journey through the landscape in North Uist, Callum and Ulry's references to landmarks, to that journey, to that landscape, and their deep affinity and affection for it. And I think in many ways, for me, it sums up the kind of relationship and the kind of musical relationship that Runrig had, with Scotland, with the landscape. Runrig's music for me was often, a big landscape of sound, and it often placed us in the kind of magnificence of the landscape, whether it was references to the Cuillins or to the openness of the western side of Uist and North Uist, and just these references.
Well, I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
And the reverence and the appreciation that comes through these fantastic songs.
Yeah.
And if I was from Uist, which I'm not, but I do know, I have many Uist friends who just think of Flower of the West as just being like a glorious anthem to the landscape they grew up in,
Oh, it's a wonderful song, and we're going to play you out with that. But Donnie, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Karin, as always, a pleasure.
And much love to your family. I hope you have a wonderful year, 2021. I hope it's a good one for you.
And likewise to you and to all of your audience out there. I hope that 2021 is a wonderful year, brings you all health, happiness, and fulfillment.
Thanks, Donnie.